everyone. I can see quite a few participants coming through. I might just give it another minute or so to make sure the number gets stable and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll make a start, and if maybe someone could confirm in the chat that everything is happening, everything is working perfectly fine, we'll get ready to go. We'll welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this October webinar with Nell Bennett. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're meeting. For me, that's the Kombumerri peoples of the Yugambeh language group on the lands we call the Gold Coast. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations colleagues here today. So today we have Dr. Nell Bennett presenting to us on the topic, the bureaucracy of violence, organisational survival, and the challenge of disengagement. Nell is a researcher with expertise in terrorism, political violence, and strategic studies. Her work focuses on how violent organisations evolve, endure, and end. She's currently a Blue Security Fellow with La Trobe Asia and the Blue Security Consortium, and editor of the Journal of Policing, Intelligence, and Counter-Terrorism. She holds a PhD and Masters of Research from Macquarie University and graduated from the Diploma in Law with the Stuart Spencer Prize for Academic Excellence. In addition to her academic work, Nell practices in criminal law at the Victorian Bar. She's the author of Euskadi Ta Aska Ta Suna, a case study on terrorist dynamics and the fight to survive, and editor of Strategic Minds and Terrorist Challenges in the Indo-Pacific. This presentation is based on the book on terrorist dynamics and Nell's PhD. And it promises to be a fantastic talk on organizational culture and the need for terrorist organizations to survive and terrorist goals in conflict as well. So very much looking forward to it. The process is that Nell will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll move into questions and discussion. When you have questions at the end, when we get to the Q&A part, please put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform, not into the chat. And then I'll jump back on at that point and moderate the discussion, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions. So Nell, I'll hand back over to you and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from, which is the Wurundjeri people, and also pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining us this evening. So it's my very great pleasure to talk to you this evening about counterterrorism, counterterrorism policy, and present what I hope is an interesting and slightly different perspective on counterterrorism and understanding terrorist organizations and their dynamics. And basically, I'm introducing an organizational approach to terrorism and counterterrorism. So what I'd like to do this evening is, first of all, introduce the approach, talk about the case study that I'm using to discuss this research, which is the case of Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, the Basque separatist organization or terrorist organization that operated in the north of Spain, and then talk about the insights that this approach and this case can provide to practitioners and policymakers. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Just one moment. And just give me a second. How's that looking? How does that look? Is that all working okay?
That's great, Nell.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So, as we all know, terrorism is a major challenge for practitioners and policymakers worldwide. And in fact, civil conflict has been the most common form of conflict in the post-World War II world. And one of the reasons for this is that many of these conflicts, well, these conflicts, they last a long time. You just need to cast your mind to some of the most salient organizations. Say, for example, the IRA, FARC, Sendero Luminoso, of course, ETA. Think about Lakshya Taiba in the north of India. Think about the Tamil Tigers. These are conflicts that drag on for decades. Now, in terrorism research, there's a lot of focus on why terrorist conflicts begin. and how they end. But there is not as much attention paid to these protracted conflicts and not as much attention paid to the question of why don't conflicts end? And in particular, why don't they end when, on an objective assessment of the situation, it would appear that the circumstances are right for resolution? And that's what I want to talk about this evening. So, states obviously expend vast resources on combating terrorism, but it continues to be a formidable challenge for governments around the world. And typically, governments will use a combination of incentives and coercion, or carrot and stick sort of approaches, no? So, on the incentive side, they may offer amnesties, power sharing deals, development aid, offer concessions, all of these sorts of things to address the demands of the terrorist organization in the hope that this will diminish the threat. On the coercion side, they may launch military offensives, attack safe havens, impose repression. There's also targeted killing, all these sorts of things that are designed to break up the groups and to limit their organizational capacity. But in spite of this, we still see these conflicts persisting. Now, that's not to say that these efforts aren't having impact, and often quite significant impact. And signs of effective counterterrorism campaigns are defections, for example, the loss of safe havens, the loss of resources, loss of finance. But oftentimes, these terrorist groups, they persist and they often regroup as well, particularly after heavy repression. Repression could also cause groups to splinter, and these splinter groups can continue to perpetuate conflict. So what we see is that most terrorist campaigns don't end in a clear victory for either side, neither for the terrorists nor for the incumbent governments. Now, incumbent governments usually prevail, and terrorist victories are extremely rare. So, generally, terrorists lose, but they lose slowly and at enormous cost. So, even though these terrorist campaigns can reduce the capacity of organizations, we still have this issue of persistence and the fact that even when they're forced to lie low, even when they're weakened, terrorists often continue and they rarely give up, even under concerted pressure. So this leads to a puzzling scenario in many conflicts, and that is that oftentimes the government has the upper hand, both militarily and materially, and oftentimes it looks like the terrorist cause is doomed, and yet the conflict will persist in some form. So I'd like to talk about the paradox that this gives rise to. The paradox is that oftentimes these conflicts persist even when it seems irrational. Terrorists fight even when their chances of victory are effectively nil. They are facing diminishing returns as conflicts continue, and there often comes a point at which it would seem rational for them to accept a negotiated settlement or simply leave the conflict, but still they continue. Now, we have a lot of accepted explanations for terrorist action, and these theories have yielded extraordinary insight that assists counterterrorism practitioners and scholars. And these include greed and grievance, they include the popular support, external funding, and these all tell part of the story, but they don't explain why, when the terrorists face mounting costs, mounting dangers, and at the same time are often offered an attractive alternative, they don't choose to lay down their arms. So this says to me that there is another part of the puzzle that we're overlooking. because I don't accept the idea that terrorists are irrational. I don't accept the idea that they are ideologues, that they are simply motivated out of a love of violence. I argue that terrorists are rational actors like we are. That is, we're boundedly rational, we're rational within certain constraints. And they weigh up the pros and cons of their actions, just like any one of us. So there is another part of the puzzle, and that is that when we talk about terrorist organizations, we tend to focus on the first half of that, the terrorist half. What we don't look at is the organizational part. So, first and foremost, terrorist organizations are organizations. Much like a legal organization, much like governments, much like corporations, institutions, dare I say universities, terrorist organizations operate the same way as legal organizations. They have bureaucracies, they have internal structures and roles, and these dynamics can explain why these movements persist beyond the point at which one would think it would be rational to continue fighting. So, the approach that I apply is the organizational survival approach. And fundamentally, it comes down to this, the idea that organizations want to survive. Organizations have multiple aims, but above all of them is the ultimate desire to ensure their own survival. Because when we think about terrorist organizations, terrorist groups, they're not just collections of ideologically motivated people. They are structures. And when we think about conflicts, oftentimes we'll think about the actors in conflicts by, dare I say, their brands, the salient features that we attach to different sides. For example, if you think about Nazis versus the Allies or um, ISIS versus the West, for example. Um, but what we're actually talking about is we're talking about organizations, because it's the organizations that make the strategic decisions about whether to attack, whether to withdraw, whether to accept a deal, whether to negotiate, whether to scuttle a deal. And the dynamics of organizations have been well studied. They've been well, there's an extraordinary amount of organizational research in business studies, in organizational studies. And in spite of the fact that as terrorism scholars, we are studying terrorist organizations, there's been remarkably little crossover. We really haven't taken advantage of all the accumulated knowledge in organizational studies. So, oh, see, I've jumped ahead with my slides. Um, Classical organizational theory observes that the primary goal of any organization is its own survival. And a key dynamic that occurs within organizations is a thing called goal displacement. So basically, an organization will typically form around a shared purpose, um, whether that is the pursuit of freedom or to create, an innovative product in the terms in business world. But over time, that goal is very easily replaced by goals that are directly related to the perpetuation of the organization itself. If you think about it, think about the genesis of an organization. Think about that, people coming together with that ambition, that desire to pursue a shared goal. But what happens once an organization forms? Well, what happens is it typically develops into a bureaucracy. And as anybody who's ever worked in a bureaucracy, I believe would attest, the number one objective of any bureaucracy is to protect itself, to protect and to expand, because that's the iron law of bureaucracy. So that's one aspect of it. Going back to this issue of goal displacement, goal displacement is pervasive and it's prevalent, but there are certain goals that are particularly vulnerable to being displaced. And those goals are what I call the fuzzy goals. So the intangible goals. And if you think about a terrorist organization, typically their goals are intangible. So, for example, freedom, freedom from oppression. Well, what does that actually mean? How do you measure that? How do you know when you've achieved that goal? How do we know the date at which we are free from oppression? As human beings, one of the things we like to do is we like to be able to measure things. So, what often happens is the fuzzy goal gets replaced by concrete goals, tangible goals, countable goals. So, the goal of freedom from oppression might be displaced by goals like boosting recruitment, generating revenue, successful attacks, successful kidnappings, media coverage. These things are things that can basically become a terrorist organization's KPIs. And as human beings, we have this tendency where we will focus in on what we can measure. And in the process, we forget about the, the more esoteric goals. Now, I argue that we actually have a blind spot in counterterrorism strategy because we rarely account for the self-preservation instincts of terrorist organizations. There is still this belief that, the right combination of tactics will eventually achieve a victory. So if we're addressing the grievances, the stated grievances of the terrorist, if they're militarily cornered, if we can just find that right counter narrative that's going to undercut their ideological statement, then we can make make progress against the terrorist organization. But what if the thing that is driving the persistence is actually being overlooked? Because what we see with terrorist organizations is that oftentimes they will adapt their objectives and their rhetoric in response to the external circumstances. So, where it's going to suit their objectives, they may moderate their position. So, for example, if the populace, think maybe they're being a little bit hard-lined to get more popular support, they might just soften it a little bit. If it suits their purposes, they may radicalize. If their demands are being met, they may have to change their demands. If they are struggling with recruitment, they may deliberately provoke the state into overreacting. And all of these maneuvers are designed to keep the struggle alive and to keep the organization intact. So, a key issue here is goals. And when I talk about goals, I distinguish what I call the actual goals or the stated goals. Sorry, the public goals or the stated goals from the actual goals. So the stated goals or the public goals, the goals that the organization presents to the world that they are pursuing, maybe, for example, freedom, something, like that, liberation from oppression, what have you. And these goals are extremely important. They're important from a propaganda perspective. They're important for recruitment perspective. They're important for branding because terrorist organizations are extremely awake to the importance of branding. But that doesn't mean that these are the goals that the organization is actually pursuing. And there's an opportunity cost involved in paying too much attention to those stated goals, those public goals. This also raises another issue, and that is that actually addressing a terrorist organization's goals may not actually resolve a conflict if by doing so you're actually undermining the group's reason for being. So we see this, there's one of these paradoxes, is often after government concessions, there'll be a spike in violence. Well, if you think about what a government concession is, that's a really dangerous position for a terrorist organization because if their goals are being met, what are their members going to do? Are they going to declare mission accomplished and go off and do something else? It's putting them in a difficult position because they may be put in a position where they need to dissolve or demobilize and basically put themselves out of business. So I think it's also important to think about the benefits of group membership, and you're all very familiar with this, particularly in the context of violent extremism and civil conflict. Group membership of a group provides enormous benefits, both tangible and intangible. It can be things like money, a stipend. You may not be getting income, but oftentimes terrorist members are given some kind of monetary compensation, and in certain circumstances that can be quite a lot. They might be getting a flat, they might be getting a car, they might be getting weapons or training, positions of power, all of these sorts of things. On the intangible side, there's the camaraderie, sense of purpose. There's, having a cause, being part of something greater than yourself, having identity. If you think about people who join perhaps in their teenage years, and maybe they're in the organization for 10 years, that might be their whole adult identity is, being a member of this organization. Now, another concept that you will all be very familiar with is that of loss aversion. Losing something hurts us more than gaining something pleases us. I'm going to feel the loss of $50 more than I'll be pleased by being given $50. And this applies particularly to this sort of situation where asking somebody to leave an organization or asking an organization to dissolve, they're going to feel that a lot more acutely than they would be compensated by being awarded a position, say, for example, in a political party or the military of an incumbent government, for example. So that's another factor to take into account. And I don't see that necessarily reflected in the contemporary counterterrorism strategy. So, according to this approach, we should be awake to the fact that terrorist organizations will adapt and refine and redefine their objectives in line with circumstances. And if they're getting what they're asking for, well, they may need to start asking for different things. They may need to change the enemy. They may need to come up with new grievances so that the fight goes on. I think that terrorists are rational actors, with the caveat that, none of us are ever that rational, but within the balance of it. And when we're looking at the pros and cons that they're weighing up, this approach simply augments the calculus. We're saying that there is more at play here. There are also the benefits and the disadvantages involved in continuing a struggle on one hand and demobilizing on the other. So, in exploring this particular case, this particular theory, I used the case study of ETA, the separatist organization in the north of Spain. And ETA, Euskadi Askatasuna, was a Basque separatist organization. It came out of a very repressive period in Spanish political history. It was born of the late 1950s. It was created by Basque students, and it was in response to very heavy-handed repression from General Franco, and in particular, a regime that denied the Basque people any expression of their political, well, well, they had no political rights, but also any expression of their culture, their heritage. They weren't allowed to use their own language, for example. Um, so no signs of regional identity were permitted under this regime. And when I decided to study this particular organization, I wanted to get a deep insight into the people and the culture to really understand what were the key drivers and dynamics. What kept this organization going past the point at which one would think that they would lay down their weapons, because they persisted from the 1950s into about 2011. So the first thing I started doing was I started learning Euskera, the Basque language, because I mean, Euskera is a beautiful language. It's a notoriously difficult language. No one knows where it comes from. It's not related to any other language. And so it's a key part of Basque identity. And it's one of those costly signals of group membership. The fact that when a person would go to the effort of learning this language signals that they are sympathetic to the Basque cause. So I started learning the language, and in doing so, I got a little bit into the Basque community in Australia, and I heard that in the mountains of Gipuzkoa, a region in the Basque country, there was a monk who had an archive. And the story of this monk, Aita Aguirre, was that he had been a sort of trusted outsider of the organization. And when members left ETA, so former members, they donated papers to him. And so the story was that this monk had an extraordinary archive of documents from inside ETA. Well, it sounded too good to be true, but certainly worth a trip to Spain. So I flew to Spain, jumped on a coach in Madrid, and made my way up to the mountains of Guipúzcoa. And I rented a room in a convent, which was across the road, a little narrow road from the monastery where the monk had his archive. And on my first day there, I think it was a Sunday, I went and knocked on the door, and Aitagire opened the door, and I by that stage had very, very little euskera, but I was able to say, Kaixo, ni Nel nice, ni Australiaco nice, which is hi, I'm Nell, I'm Australian. And I think he was so bemused, he just sort of said, come on in. And Aitagire, wonderful, wonderful man, started showing me some of the papers from his collection. And I was absolutely enthralled. Now, this archive is a professional archive. It's an extraordinary research centre. It is a place that I cannot recommend more fervently to researchers because they have an amazing collection. So I visited the archives during their regular hours and was able to go through the catalogue. And I saw an entry in the catalogue for internal documents. I asked to have a look, thinking that sounded good, but it's probably nothing. The archivist came out with the box, and I opened the box and looked in, and I started flipping through these papers. I couldn't really believe what I was looking at, because what I was looking at was actual transcripts of the meetings that the terrorist organization held. So this terrorist group got together at periodically over the years, and they held meetings, and someone was taking minutes. Now, if you were to say that to somebody in organizational studies, they say, well, of course, that's how organizations work. But coming from terrorism, where we're constantly asking ourselves, why do they do this? Why do they do that? Well, they'd written it all down. So I was able to actually read all of their decision-making processes over a period of about, goodness, about 6 years. And that's what I did. I copied the documents, translated them, made the first English translations, and studied them, and was able to chart exactly the decision processes that they went through. Now, ETA had an extremely violent campaign. It went for decades. And the interesting thing about ETA is that they had their most brutal years were during Spain's transition from dictatorship to democracy. And this is part of this paradox. Um, So now ETA, I'm not going to get into the weeds about the different factions of ETA, but there are two main sort of sides. But there was ETA M, ETA PM, ETA Militar, ETA Political Militar. ETA Political Militar was a organization that believed in a combination of a military and a political solution for the Basque Country. So my hypothesis going in was that if ETA was purely motivated by their stated political goals and their grievances, when Spain transitioned to democracy, when they were given full democratic freedom, full expression of their cultural, their regional culture, they should have disbanded. But that's not the way it went. Um, and the extraordinary thing for me was I was able to read exactly the processes and the arguments that the different leaders advanced at the many debates that they held over these crucial years. And what I found so striking, because I'd come from, you know, years of reading about terrorist ideology and greed and grievance and so on and so forth, what I found so striking about the internal documents was how tactical it was, how focused they were on what was best for the organization. So when they talked about the use of violence, it was very much in terms of its instrumental value. And in one particular section of a debate, the leaders talked about the fact that violence is a tool of political negotiation, and it's used when it is helpful, and when it's not helpful, it's set aside until it becomes useful again. So there was no discussion. I mean, I read hundreds, thousands of pages. There was very little discussion of ideology. It was not about violence for the sake of violence. It was not about revenge. It was not about um, retaliation, anything like that. Only retaliation in the terms of whether it is appropriate strategically for the organization. But what did they focus on? They focused on popular support. Why? Because they knew that they needed popular support in order to survive. They focused on recruitment. Again, they need that to survive. A big issue for ETA over the years is they had multiple ceasefires. Each ceasefire did them harm because when they were not perpetrating attacks, they couldn't recruit. Because who wants to join a terrorist organization that's not doing terrorism? That's not a thing. When they were in ceasefires, they couldn't raise money because how are they going to get their revolutionary tax? How are they couldn't kidnap anyone. Where was the money coming from? And these were issues that they had to debate back and forth. So again, I've jumped ahead with my slides, excuse me. One of the key decision points for them was when democracy was introduced and there were the first regional elections. And they created their own affiliated political party and they were able to participate in elections. And of course, there was a lot of debate about whether this would weaken the organization or whether it would strengthen the organization. And ultimately, it was held in the beginning that it would strengthen the organization. But of course, as time progressed and the Basque people found that they no longer needed an armed organization, it ended up being the beginning of the end for them. So now I'm conscious of time. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the trajectory of the organization, but I would like to talk about some of the implications of this particular case study and this approach. And the trajectory of ETA, particularly ETA Political Militar, which has been the focus of my research, this can provide key insights for addressing terrorism and particularly addressing that paradox of why so often terrorist groups choose to continue operating when they are being offered generous demobilization agreements. And that is because um, the organizational self-interest takes over. And that was the thing that we saw, that I saw with ETA, was that they framed their strategic interest in terms of what would strengthen the organization, what would weaken the organization. Popular support was important to the extent that it helped the organization stay together. Ceasefires were useful when that garnered political popular support, but they were damaging when it made the organization irrelevant. When they couldn't perpetrate attacks, they couldn't brand themselves. They couldn't distinguish themselves in the marketplace. They were effectively sidelined and marginalized politically. And hence they had to break the ceasefire and continue perpetrating attacks, not because they loved violence, not because of ideology, but because they found themselves being marginalized. We also see mission creep. They redefined their objectives. They decided to take on new causes because the things that they originally asked for, political freedom, cultural freedom, these things had been granted to them. So they had to find new battles to fight in order to stay in the game. So, what does this mean for contemporary counterterrorism? Because I'm talking about something that happened last century. Um, well, what it means is that we can expect protracted resistance even after concessions, because simply addressing the public demands of terrorist organizations, whether that's autonomy, whether that's aid, whether that's whatever it is, that's not going to address the actual drivers of the conflict. So I think it's important to anticipate that. And it's also important to anticipate that concessions may weaken an organization, but there will still be a hardline faction that will continue. And we've seen this in many organizations. So, for example, Northern Ireland and Colombia. It's important to address the organization and not just the cause, because counterterrorism has to address the organization's ability to operate. So it has to undermine their internal cohesion, their finances, their recruitment, encouraging defection, using informants, protecting people who choose to leave is very important. And this is going to diminish the organization. Cutting off funding, for example, things will starve them of their oxygen, but this is not going to be the full story. It's important to provide attractive off-ramps, remembering the many benefits that these uh, members had within their organization. It's not just enough to say, if you leave, we won't prosecute. For someone who's been a local hero, that's not going to cut it. It's important to keep loss aversion in mind. Now, in the Basque case, for example, many of the former members found meaningful roles within Basque political parties, and we see this in other cases as well. And this can be an alternative where it's appropriate. So, strengthening moderate camps within terrorist organizations, marginalizing hardliners and marginalizing extremists, and accepting ultimately that terrorists lose, but they lose slowly. So it's important to be in it for the long game and avoid actions that will inadvertently rejuvenate the organization, such as indiscriminate attacks or repression that will affect civilians, which can have the undesired effect of boosting recruitment. But ultimately, it's important to understand that we are dealing with bureaucracies, and bureaucracies are designed to survive. So I note the time. I'm very happy to discuss further, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this.
Thanks so much. Now that was fantastic, and you're at 4:40 on the dot, so
Ah,
that's very rare and impressive. Um, we have some questions starting to come in. If you have any questions, please just put them in the Q&A, as we said at the beginning, rather than the chat. So we have these coming through. Let's just jump in then with Mark, and I'll have lots of questions too. So we'll see how we go. Mark says, thanks, Nell, for a fascinating presentation. Can you please provide your thoughts on the impact on so-called narco-terrorists from South America with the continued US strikes in the Caribbean? A loaded question, I know, given we don't know whether they are so-called foreign terrorist organizations and these groups are profit-driven and not politically or ideologically driven. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with the case, so I can't speak to the specific case. All I can speak to is general principles really, um, because if they're profit driven, this fits into that greed aspect, which is, like I say, it's an important part of understanding how terrorist organizations operate, because ultimately, with any organization, there's always going to be the aspect of making money. They need money to survive, and that can be more prominent in profit-driven organizations. And I would say ultimately the same principles apply because particularly once, as soon as an organization solidifies and you have that bureaucracy, there are going to be so many vested interests in keeping it going. And particularly people who are in positions of power, they have the most to lose. And one thing to be aware of is that people in positions of power not only have the most to lose, but they've got the most say in the trajectory of the organization, and they have the ability to basically scuttle any potential deals. So I know I'm speaking in general terms, but I'm afraid I can't speak to the specific case.
Thank you, Noah and Mark, for the question. Yeah, that was a difficult one to throw at you first up. But I think it also speaks to one of my comments, which is to say that I think in public perception, everyone has this idea of what terrorism is, the Al Qaeda or Islamic State style terrorism, and then now there's this recognition, especially after Christchurch, that we need to recognize right-wing extremism as a threat too, and everything that that entails with neo-Nazi groups and everything. But I think why this is so good to return to as a topic is because I think most of us working in the terrorism field do understand that terrorism has taken place across historical context, in all sorts of different countries for all sorts of different ideologies, and aren't so necessarily locked into that. And narco-terrorism is another example of that sort of variation on terrorism. So, really interesting question.
No, I
Haley.
think I think overall, what unites organizations
Hmm,
is often overlooked. They're a lot more similar
absolutely, yeah.
than we tend to accept.
Yeah, in terms of that, so Haley's asked, well, firstly said thank you for such fascinating insights into how you found and collected your data. I agree, that was an amazing story to listen to, and the lengths that you've gone to collect that is really inspiring. Haley says you mentioned ceasefire as undesirable for the organization's survival. Were there any other prominent undesirable factors that were perceived as weakening to the organization, even though you might think they're a good thing?
Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, this is sort of going a little bit of a tangent and something that I think merits a lot more discussion, uh, analysis, no? And that is the actions of other terrorist organizations. So a lot of the documents I read talked about the fact that because there was ETA had different factions. And so the one that I particularly focused on, ETA PM, held these ceasefires. But while they were holding ceasefires, there were other factions that were still committing attacks. And there was issues around the fact that oftentimes those attacks were being misattributed to them, or it was affecting public perception of terrorism. And ETA PM were really concerned about the fact that they could not control their own brand narrative. So again, talking like an organization, they were really worried about the fact that this was affecting their position in the marketplace. That's just one example. The documents, like I say, was, I mean, more than 1,000 pages, and there was so much in there. And I strongly recommend that other researchers explore the information there because the scope for terrorism analysis is just enormous.
Thank you. Constantinus has said that organizational theory tells us that groups tend to resist change and get locked into specific patterns over time. Do extremist groups follow those same patterns, so they get locked into to specific patterns over time? And if so, what does that mean for how we design counterterrorism policies in response?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I haven't given that a lot of thought. Where my mind immediately goes to is standard operating procedures, because of course we're dealing with the bureaucracy, and so organizations have ways of working. There's organizational knowledge and organizational wisdom, and people, we're all human beings. We've done things a particular way in the past. Maybe something worked one way in the past, and we think it's going to work again the same way. There was some interesting discussion at the point where ETA really could see the writing was on the wall, and there was a lot of calls from within the organization to disband. There were some lone voices saying, you know what we need? We just need some really good attacks, and that's going to be a game changer, and that's going to boost recruitment, and the people will love us again. And I think that's sort of that idea of, people thinking, well, it worked for us in the 70s. Why won't it work for us now? Um, I think that was part of the question. I'm not sure what the rest of the question. Sorry, I've forgotten the rest of the question.
No, just
Um,
yeah, just do extremist groups get locked into specific patterns in a similar way to organizations? So
I think yes, to a degree. There's also this interesting thing, and this is discussed a lot in uh, organizational theory and goal displacement, where organizations adapt to their surrounding ecosystem. So I mentioned very briefly, one thing that you see is that organizations um, will adapt to what their market wants. If their market wants them to be more moderate, they'll moderate. If the market wants them to be more hardlined, that's where they'll go. So they're very awake to what's going on around them, and that's how they survive. They're constantly adapting because if an organization doesn't adapt, I mean, you see it in business, they're not going to make it.
absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Cynthia has asked if international research organizations have picked up your framework to apply in their analysis and provide advice to governments, for example, in Europe and the United States.
Oh, Cynthia, that's a very kind question. Uh, Look, I don't think so, but really, what I'm talking about is nothing new. Like I say, these are things that have been studied to death. Um, my objective really is it's just a call for us to pay more attention to what our colleagues in organizational studies have already established. There's an extraordinary amount of information there that would be very useful for us.
Thank you. I mean, I think the implication of that question is also that your findings have a lot of value, so I certainly wouldn't downplay and say that it's all been said before or anything, because I think it's fascinating, and so particularly in the context of they've been thinking a lot about like the rational, irrational kind of points lately, particularly when you start thinking about mixed motives, unclear motives, conspiracy, extremism. Does it matter if like to what extent are some terrorists rational and to what extent are some irrational? So, even just aside from the specific case study that you're looking at, there are so many sort of broad findings from that. I
Yeah,
just
and
think,
that's a very nuanced discussion, and I've really glossed over it. And of course, there are always outliers, and I am talking in the collective. I think another interesting thing for us to think about as a discipline is the level of analysis. There's a lot of focus on the individual level. There's a lot of focus on the state level. That meso level, that group level, I don't think we have been paying enough attention to that level of analysis. I think there's a lot of room there.
yeah, could we continue with that? So please keep the questions coming. I mean, I'm happy enough because then I get to ask questions if there's none in the list, but please do put them in. Should we continue on that point then around um, rational and irrational? And I think that point you just said also about individual versus group based. I think there's been a bit of an assumption that we've moved on from an era of Al Qaeda and Islamic State as these, kind of institutions, involving governance, especially Islamic State with its sort of systems of governance and everything, to this real mess of things at the moment, particularly lone actors, idiosyncratic causes and everything. Yeah, so maybe just push you on that question a little bit more. Say, to what extent do you think organizational theory and your findings can speak to the current threat environment, which involves where there's a lot of focus on lone actor, grievance-based violence?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I will, absolutely disclaim that uh, my research has been in terrorist organizations as opposed to extremism, and I I'm not that as familiar with the lone actor phenomenon. Um, that said, I would not be surprised if with some of these movements, there's a lot more organization going on than is necessarily apparent at first glance. Um, I, I I would suggest that, but I would have to defer to people who are more knowledgeable on extremism and these newer movements. My
Yeah.
research is a bit retro.
It's not retro. I mean, it speaks so much like your point about branding, right? Like the neo-Nazi organizations and their symbols, the importance of that and the tactical displacement involved in, well, they've outlawed these symbols, so we know we can't use swastikas publicly, but we still want to get our branding out there. So the NSN has its sort of Helly Hansen jackets and these subtle ways of getting, of extremist symbols in there. So I think you do speak to a lot of that as well.
Oh, they know what they're doing, and this is the thing of adaptation. No, if and counterterrorism is important because cutting off these avenues is important, but they are always going to adapt.
Yeah. Could I also, please, yeah, add any questions that you still want to ask from the group as well? Can I just ask then about the rational, irrational point?
Hmm.
Because that's one thing that, I mean, particularly as well, originally a lawyer, but then ended up in a criminology school where lots of people talk about rational actors, right? The rational actor theory is a huge part of criminology and the idea of designing preventive measures around the idea that, you know, thieves, for example, will weigh up which house is easier to rob, and it's not, so there's rationality involved, and that's a really tricky debate in terrorism because once you start involving ideologies, religious duties that are claimed, all this kind of stuff. So, and then there's also quite big philosophical or ethical questions around what is rational for humans to do. Like you can like questions around like is altruism rational or not, and things like that. So it's actually a
Mhm.
really fundamental, difficult to answer question.
Absolutely.
So could you please just clarify a little bit more? Do you consider it rational for an organization to act in the goal of self-preservation for organizational reasons? If it is choose so like the
Hmm.
goals as they want to, like say independence, whatever it is, have been satisfied,
Yep.
but they are still acting in accordance with self-preservation of the organization for bureaucratic reasons, and they make decisions in relation to that, is that irrational or rational or on a spectrum?
Okay.
I
So
can see the link between
yeah.
means and ends still, because there is an end of bureaucracy as an end in itself. But at that point, are you saying that it is more irrational because the rational original goal has gone?
I would say that the original goal quickly becomes irrelevant
Mm.
because of this issue of goal displacement. And that's a big concept that I don't think we're as familiar with as we should be in terrorism studies. And again, I've gone over it very, very quickly. But it's, particularly when we've got goals that we struggle to measure. You know, if our goal is what, the one I've been trotting out, freedom from oppression. That's a very, very difficult goal to pursue. And so we quickly shift to our proxy goals, which we can measure. In terms of the rationality, I absolutely am I'm very, very much a follower of very thin rational choice analysis. And where I talk about the combination of this approach and rational choice is saying that I think whether we're looking at the individual level or the group level, we weigh pros and cons. But to understand that calculus that another person or an entity makes, we have to understand what things are being weighed. And this dynamic, this iron law of bureaucracy, this driver for survival of the organization itself, of the group, is something that we haven't been including in our calculus. So we haven't looked at that as terms of one of the factors that weighs in favor of persistence. And it links in with loss aversion and also status quo bias. You're in this organization, it's what you know. the government saying amnesty. They're saying you're going to get all these great things. They'll give you an apartment. Is it going to be as nice as the apartment I have now? You're going to get new friends. Well, I don't know who they are. You know, a new job in a political party. Is that going to work? Are they going to renege? Do we trust them? You know, these are all things that, are going to be key factors that are weighed in this rational act of calculus. So I think the short answer to your question is, yeah, I think they are rational. I think these are rational decisions. Um, and I acknowledge all of the issues with rational choice analysis, even though it is the dominant analysis sort of framework that's applied in civil war studies broadly, and I'd also say terrorism studies, but very much a thin rational choice analysis in that we have to understand what the things are that motivate each person and each entity.
That's
Did
fascinating.
I answer that question? Or did I just
Yeah,
ramble?
no, that really helps me because I was thinking more about, well, they've got their original goals and they're
Mm.
acting rationally towards them, and then the goals disappear. So are they acting rationally, irrationally? And that's not so much your point as from the beginning, it can be about organizational survival, and
Oh,
that
absolutely. And the original goal is window dressing.
yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think the scariest part about it is not so much the terrorism part as the fact that bureaucracy can be an end in itself,
Oh, yeah.
and that explains a lot about the world. But that's why it is like it's not just about terrorism in that reason. Like you're explaining human behavior and organizational decisions as well. Like it speaks to both of those. Uh,
Mm.
I realize the time. I have probably lots more questions. If I could sneak in one quick one at the end, um, which is around what role do you, because I've been thinking a little bit about Jamar Islamiyah as well and their recent decision to disband. And I'm not an expert on Indonesia, but it does seem to me that sometimes decisions to disband, like for all these sorts of reasons, it can be that the writing's on the wall for them because of a disruption strategy from police. They've had a lot of their senior members arrested and so on. And so there's this public messaging around, well, we're choosing to disband, we're sorry for all the violence and so on. But actually it's because they have to, because they had so many disruption activities against them. So to what role, just briefly at the end, did disruption play in Edda's decision, like decapitation of leaders as a strategy, and that kind of thing?
It was extremely the counterterrorism campaign was extremely effective, and it goes back to what I said early on is that terrorists lose, but they lose slowly.
Mm.
So it took decades, and it's a long game. So yes, the disruption was extremely effective. It it took a long time, but the organization that persisted from the 1980s was a very, very weakened organization, and it did not really, it really persisted at a much reduced level, and certain factions really persisted in name only. So it was extremely effective. And ultimately, I think it just got to the point where terrorism was untenable. I think in my view, the final hit to ETA was 9/11. And that was where really they completely lost control of their brand because being a terrorist, you couldn't make the argument anymore that you were a freedom fighter. And so their brand was destroyed. And they knew it.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. And yeah, it speaks to so many. Makes me think about Islamic State and others that Islamic State had successes, as it were, in terms of governance and territory and so on. And then that sort of, yeah, slow decline through airstrikes and everything else. So, yeah, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I would love to keep talking about it, but we have reached time. So, if everyone could thank Nell Bennett for a fantastic presentation. I'll just say a few things around Avert, which is that. This is the final webinar for the year, so thank you very much for attending. And please keep an eye out for future advertisements when we resume them. And please look to follow Avert on LinkedIn and the YouTube channel, and visit Avert's website where you can also sign up for the mailing list. Um, I don't know if we have time for one. Let's see if how quick we can make this final question in the last minute. Because thank you for the presentation. I like the comment that it is self-preservation and me as a means to an end. What is the end? Self-gratification rather than a general cause.
That's a good question to end on. I'd say the end is survival.
Yeah,
That's it.
fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Mumbo, for the question as well, and Dr. Nell Bennett for a fascinating presentation. So yeah, please check out Avert's socials and website, And we look forward to seeing you in another Avert webinar soon after the break and we resume next year. So thanks
Thank you
again.
very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.